Right, welcome back. We continue our conversation on job scams and tender scams. And we want you to pay particular attention because a lot of us are vulnerable. There are schemes, clever schemes, called phishing, where they look for your personal information and then they abuse that personal information via email and other electronic means. And then smishing is where they're using SMS now, your mobile phones, to entice you. So phishing and smishing, usually the vehicles where they start communicating with you and start drawing you into an elaborate scam. And some of them are pretty sophisticated. But the cost of this is enormous. Just before we started, I spoke about cybercrime, and they estimate that it's a $400 billion problem globally, and that's just cybercrime. But just to give us a sense of the effect these things are happening on our economy and our businesses, we're now joined by Clive Ramatibela-Smith, who's an analyst, and welcome to the program. We're hearing about these job scams, these tender scams, and we look at it sometimes on an individual basis, but it is having an enormous effect on our economy, isn't it?
Top of the morning to you, Peter. Yeah. Thanks very much. It's a very difficult thing to try and actually evaluate it. That's what JP Morgan said when they did their research across the world. It's very difficult to actually put the numbers to it. You can have an estimate, as it were. You've got $400 billion, but I can bet you now it's far more more than that in actual fact, in actual numbers across the world. In the African continent alone, it is estimated that we lose close to about 200 billion in terms of those kind of scams. So, it's things that we probably want. Sometimes they get you because it's the things that we actually admire. So you get an email saying you've won the UK lottery and you all get excited. so I think that's the one thing. It's because it really is. It sounds so good. Unfortunately, when it sounds that good, it might be just too good to be true. However, the technicalities behind it as well. You've got people who actually sit hours on end sitting, trying to deceive, trying to find ways in which they can utilize the best way to actually get to people. So it is a really long process. Some people go the long way, but when it comes to tender processing, I think government in its own right has done really well in terms of making sure those mechanisms are there to make sure that there's transparency. I know with the Gauteng department, for example, the Gauteng government, they've got their open tender system, which they were celebrating a week ago, which is brilliant because then you can't say, oh, well, how did they get that tender? So all those are some of the things that government is doing initiative to try and make sure that things are open and we can actually trace them. So there is a serious issue because if you get involved in these things, livelihoods get touched, people's lives change. You're talking about sometimes people taking pension funds. That was a very sad story to hear earlier on. But those are realities that take place when people are being put into these snares. All right,
okay. All right, let's start trying to get some feedback from our audience here and also you at home at Morning Live SABC or hashtag TNA Biz Brief, and that's all one word, but it's spelt B-I-Z in between. So hashtag TNA BIZ Brief. We'll pick up your questions, your messages, and maybe even your comments of the kinds of scams that you've fallen prey to. But I think Clive pointed us in the right direction. This is almost a psychological crime. They play on your desires, and greed maybe is another word we can use. And I think ego as well plays a part in this equation. So they'll win your confidence, and once they do, a whole chain of events take place, and you're not paying the kind of attention you should be paying. But let's get a sense of what our audience is saying here as we start with Andy Pather, who's on table number 4. Andy, where are you? Okay.
The question I have is theft, fraud, and corruption is on the increase in South Africa. And what new technologies are being introduced to combat these crimes?
Okay, so let's start with the Major General, but I also want to hear from the companies because you need to protect yourselves as well. So what kind of steps have you put into place? But as a policing unit, What are we doing to combat this? Or is yours always about trying to find who did it?
The reality is that, excuse me, the reality is that from a fraud and corruption perspective, you always find yourself being in a reactive mode and trying to see what happened, where the vulnerabilities is, and then try to build preventive measures into it. I think the issue of the actual prevention, the usage of technology, should actually start at the front page where the victim is being attacked. How to protect yourself against falling prey to become a fraud or a corruption victim. Because in terms of corruption, you'll find yourself there's two parties involved. There's actually no victim there, because when we deal with the corruption side of it, it's either the corruptee or the corruptor that are dealing with it, because both of them act in their own self-interest in that sense. But when you speak about the fraud aspect of it, in fraud there you have the victim. And it's a question of what manner of fraud was committed against him and how do we protect. And in some instances, whereas the police have a duty to actually try and protect, but it's more from an advisory perspective to say, please guard against this. And in certain aspects, it is the implementation of certain legal instruments, like for instance, to ensure that you have the POPI Act, the Protection of Personal Information Act, where that has been compromised. And we find through our investigation that certain instances, be it a bank or wherever your information was lying, has been compromised, to see that those people are also being addressed, because we stopped at the perpetrator.
Right.
But I think we should go further than that to say, but where has the actual compromise started? And then it's maybe at where the information has been compromised.
Okay, to try and prevent some would-be scammers, operating in a digital environment does leave a digital footprint. Do we have the technology to trace some of these people and find them, locations and all those kinds of things?
We definitely have. We definitely have the skills as well as the technology. Because fraud, unfortunately, luckily for us, wherever you committed fraud, there's always a footprint. Now we have various stakeholders, where the police may fall short in having certain technology. Our stakeholders comes in, and we use them. Like in the banking sector, you use our stakeholders like SABC. In the private sector, you'll have certain entities that have got certain mechanisms, which we then use in order for us to proceed with the investigation and to bring the culprits to book.
But you couldn't crack Oscar's phone. Okay. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll get another part of that answer. Stay with us.